I'm Autumn Lockett,
And this is Mitch Randall.
and you're listening to Good Faith Weekly.
Welcome to Good Faith Weekly. On this edition, we are going to catch up, Autumn and I, as we talk all things Omicron, unfortunately, still lingering around. And then later in the pod, Autumn and I had the distinct pleasure of sitting down with Dr. George Mason. Dr. Mason is the outgoing pastor at Wilshire Baptist Church, just announcing his retirement this last week during the Epiphany time. And we just had a wonderful conversation, learned a lot about him, his background, his past, and his advice for the emerging generation of clergy. So stay tuned. It's going to be a good episode. We're back, Autumn. We're back.
We are
Omicron
back.
is taking over. We do not have it in the Randall household, but it's everywhere, sister.
It is everywhere. I am wearing my headphones and podcasting right now, but here in a bit I'm going to put my teacher hat on, which I haven't worn in, more than a decade because I have doing virtual school.
So, we both of us live in Norman, Oklahoma. The email went out, I think, yesterday afternoon, just as school let out. And how did you feel when you got that email saying that they were going to go back to virtual for a while?
The March 2020 of it all, Mitch. I was so my stomach just seized up because it starts to feel like, are we doing this again? But okay, here's the thing that I tell myself, right? So I'm making a fist with one hand and I have a flat hand with the other, and I'm covering my fist with my flat hand. This is something my therapist has taught me. You're safe. You're okay. We know more now. Most of our family is vaccinated. It's a safer time.
Right.
To do this. But Oklahoma's just plumb out of teachers, Mitch. Everybody just went down, has a child who's positive or has had a close encounter. And so with the MLK holiday coming up on Monday, Norman decided to just sort of move to virtual for most campuses for today and tomorrow. And my kids, of course, were thrilled.
Well, of course they were. It's so infuriating. It's so frustrating. Obviously, we're in a global pandemic. We've seen different variants of COVID-19 sweep across the globe. This latest variant, obviously Omicron, is like none other. It's been described to me as a sticky bomb. It's been described to me as a cinnamon roll that you can't get off your fingers. It's just so sticky. You get close to it, you're just going to get sticky. And we still live in a society where there's misinformation out there, where there is this attitude of obstinance in wearing masks. Autumn, I went to CVS, our local CVS here last night to pick up a prescription. Walked in with my N95 mask, just thinking, okay, this is going to be a safe spot here in this pharmacy. I was the only person besides the pharmacist and the employees wearing a mask. Everybody else in there that were picking up prescriptions, even people getting the vaccine were not wearing masks. It was the most bizarre moment in the last few weeks I've had, and it was just infuriating. Even saw a Norman police officer walk through the doors unmasked. It's just mind blowing to me.
It is. Number one, thank goodness the N95 is basically like the full armor of God in the 2020s universe, right? Because it does keep us pretty safe. Number two, I'm surprised zero about that because it wasn't so very long ago that CVS still sold cigarettes. So, they're not really the health standard that you would think a pharmacy might be.
Well, that is a great point.
Number three, have you seen the article from ABC News about line of duty deaths for police officers?
We were talking about this before we hit record, and it's very tragic because any officer loss of life on duty or off duty is tragic. They are out there on the front lines protecting us and keeping our communities safe. We appreciate that. Obviously, there are some dirty cops out there that we've talked about on this show before with racial profiling and just systemic racism within policing itself. But
There's some cultural issues.
sure, there's some cultural
right?
issues there, but for the most part, I
Yeah.
mean, these are good men and women doing good work for us and serving their community. And it was reported just this last week, 458 law enforcement deaths on in line of duty were reported in 2021. And out of that 485, get this, Autumn, 301 of them were due to COVID-19. And
No one can see this, but I'm shaking my head.
it just is mind blowing. I don't, some of these police unions, are kicking back on vaccine mandates, mask mandates. City officials are, supporting those decisions, and those decisions are killing cops.
Mhm.
And it's
Mhm.
just infuriating. And they're risking their lives all the time, and to not be taken seriously to the point where they are being kept safe from a virus that caused a majority of their deaths last year is just mind blowing to me. And I just
It is mind blowing, and it all comes back to number one, the politicization
mhm,
of COVID, right?
right,
And then all of the subsequent misinformation. If wearing a mask is a political stand, then I'm against it, and to my own detriment. Like, and folks are like literally willing to risk their lives
hmm
and the lives of their children over a political statement. And that's what Dr. Schmidtke talked about last week, that,
right.
a vaccine, a mask, a vaccine doesn't, none of it care. The virus, they don't care about your political stance. We just have to listen to the experts on this.
Yeah. I wonder what some of those police unions would say if there was a movement to take away bulletproof vest.
Right.
To me,
Or just make them optional. They're just like real optional. I
right.
mean, if you want it, great. But
Yeah. Sure.
it probably won't save your life.
Yeah. That's just what, that's what I equate that to. I mean, again, these men and women are risking their lives every day doing some incredible work. Let's take care of them. And, there's going to be those who do wear masks, who take precautions. But if your coworker and fellow officer does not wear that, and you're, in a locker room or you're in the station somewhere and it's just everywhere, you're going to get
Mhm.
it. And
Yeah.
it's maddening. So, shout out
Yeah.
to all of our police officers who are doing great work. We appreciate you. We love you. I wish that I would see more officers wearing masks, not only here in
Yeah.
Oklahoma, but across the country. So,
And if you are a person who is, helping to spread the false narrative about vaccines and masks, and you're, shaming folks who wear them and that kind of thing, there is literal blood on your hands, in my
absolutely.
opinion.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Well, another thing going on in the news this week, Autumn, is MLK Day is right around the corner. There has been a big push in Washington, D.C. to get a new Voting Right Act legislation passed named after the late civil rights icon and congressman from Georgia, John Lewis. And right now it's not looking good, Autumn, that legislation is not going to pass probably the Senate. I think it will pass the House along party lines, but not certain it's going to make its way through the Senate with 50-50 split. I wrote an article today about voting rights and how white supremacy throughout the history of the United States has played a role in voter restrictions and voter oppression. And every time I go through that history, I'm still amazed about how long it took for people that were born in this country, on this land, to vote and to have the right to vote, and for legislation to have to be passed that prevented people from jockeying local rules and to prevent people from casting their vote. It's just really really sad to see that's part of our history. It is part of our history, but it's because of that
Mhm.
history we need new legislation. Because there are almost in every state in America is dealing with some kind of legislation right now that is going to make it more difficult to vote. And those pieces of legislation are based upon, we talk about Omicron and COVID-19 misinformation. This too
Mhm.
is based upon misinformation. There were very, very few cases of voter fraud in 2020. In fact, the cases where there were voter fraud had a lot to do with more conservative uh, fraud than it did liberal fraud. But all you would hear from the right is how Democrats and how liberals are just committing fraud right and left. And that's just not the case. And even in our conservative states, and even some of our Republican governors have said, yeah, that there was no fraud in this election. But because that message lingers in the air, those same Republican governors, those same Republican controlled legislatures across the country are using that to push voter oppression and voter restrictions, making it more difficult for people to vote. And it's just infuriating.
Why are you so scared? Why are you so scared of, you know, adequate representation of equal access to voting? It's it's just oppression.
It
It's
really is.
depression and it's fear.
In my article today at goodfaithmedia.org, I asked a set of a kind of a litany of questions. And one of the
Yeah.
question was, is there a holiday that we celebrate right now that commemorates that wonderful moment when we voted to restrict people casting their ballots? I don't remember that at all. I do remember from my history classes all the celebrations of when people got to cast their votes
Yeah.
and made it easier for them to vote. I remember all of those great moments in history, but
Well,
I don't
there is
think
a holiday that we're celebrating. It's January 6th, right?
oh,
That's
that's
sort of
right. That's
voter
right.
oppression. I don't know.
Yeah,
Trying to disqualify the votes, right?
that's right. So, but the King family came out this week and said they don't think people should celebrate MLK Day unless there is a voter rights bill
Yeah.
ready for the president to
Yeah.
sign. They feel that strongly about it, and I agree. I mean, it is really scary what's going on across the country. That there is a minority group of people attempting, and it's a coup. I mean, it really is a
Mhm.
legislative coup to try to control the votes and how people cast their votes and in what manner they cast their votes, so that they can continue to gain control. And the reason for that is because they do not have the popular vote. Never will, because it's restrictive. It is
Mhm.
fundamentalism. It's right wing nonsense. And if you were to count all the votes in a proper way, then they're going to lose. But
Yeah. Yep.
they have to manipulate the system in order to win. And it's just infuriating.
It is. And we are famously a country that is supposed to be run, of the people and by the people. And by the people means all the people,
Right.
not just the elite who think they need to run things. That's not the way that we run things here. Famously so.
Exactly right.
Yeah.
So, so I hope that the John Lewis Voting Rights Act comes to fruition. I hope our congressmen, both senators and representatives, they come to their senses. The president gets to sign a bill, and we get to celebrate once again that people. It's easier for people to cast their vote because that's what it
Yeah.
means to be American. And so I hope that comes to fruition. Well, Autumn, you and I got to sit down with Dr. George Mason this week. Dr. Mason is the pastor at Wilshire Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas. He's been there for 30 years now. But this last Epiphany, he announced his retirement. And I asked him during the interview, hey, wait a minute. George Mason doesn't retire. And we had a lot of fun with George talking about his career and his time at Wilshire. And he also provides some really sage advice for emerging clergy as he looks to the future of the church and the future of Wilshire in particular. So it's a great interview. Stay tuned. Here's our conversation with Dr. George Mason.
I'm Starlette Thomas, and I invite you to join us for Good Faith Stories. It's a new podcast series from Good Faith Media. In each episode of Good Faith Stories, we'll bring you a collection of different stories tied to a theme. Unique and true stories as told by the people who live them. Each story is short, 6 or 7 minutes, with a little mood music. Listen to Good Faith Stories wherever you get your podcasts, and find us online at goodfaithmedia.org.
Welcome back to Good Faith Weekly. On this episode, we've got a very special guest with us and a close friend of mine. George Mason has been senior pastor at Wilshire Baptist Church since August 1989. His long tenure follows the pattern of his predecessor, Bruce McKeever, who was pastor of Wilshire for 30 years also. George is a nationally recognized religious leader serving the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, Fellowship Southwest, Pastors for Texas Children, and Faith Forward Dallas at Thanksgiving Square. He is the lead advisor for the Baptist House of Studies at Perkins School of Theology at Southern Methodist University. He is a frequent op-ed contributor to the Dallas Morning News on subjects of public interest, the interest religion, such as public education, race relations, and predatory lending. He is also the founder and president of Faith Commons, a multi-ethnic, multi-faith organization committed to bringing faith to life by promoting the common good. As part of his work with Faith Commons, he hosts an audio and video podcast, Good God, Conversations That Matter About Faith and Public Life. And you can find that podcast at thegoodgodproject.com. That's www.goodgodproject.com. On Epiphany this last year, Dr. Mason announced his pending retirement as the pastor at Wilshire, beginning later in the year. Mason is married to his remarkable wife, Kim. They have 3 wonderful adult children and 6 amazing grandchildren. Dr. Mason was influential in the creation of Good Faith Media, and he is a good friend of mine. With all of that said, Dr. Mason, welcome to Good Faith Weekly.
Thank you so much, Mitch. And now, after listening to all of that, I realize all the more why I'm retiring. I have to let go of something, right? That's exhausting. My goodness.
Oh, that's fantastic. So what's so funny about that's my first question. My first question is, what are you thinking? George Mason is not supposed to retire. I mean, come on. You're just supposed to go on and go on and go on.
Right. Well, I think the answer to that is I would like to go on and go on and go on. But in all the roles that go along with that, I think it's becoming increasingly challenging to manage it all and to stay healthy and to find a rhythm. And that's a nice byproduct or a result, I suppose, of what I think has been way leading on to way, where I've just stayed really interested in all the things that are happening here at our church and in the community, in the wider Baptist world, in theological education, in ecumenical and interfaith work. And, so I keep becoming more and more invested in all of that. And it's actually not fair to anyone for me to not give my best efforts to everything. So the thing that I think I needed to make a decision about was what has to go. And after 33 years nearly here, I think it's time to hand it over to somebody else as senior pastor.
There you go.
So we are going to focus most of our conversation on your last 30 years at Wilshire, but there were some significant years prior to that. Let's talk a little bit about your early career. You grew up in New York, attended college in Florida, went to the Southern Baptist Seminary in Texas, and pastored a church in the South. What was it like for you as a young man finding your way in the world?
What an interesting question, Autumn. Thank you. I think I came from a very devout Christian home, and my brother and sister and I all have a good spiritual heritage. And we all have strong self-esteem and have found ourselves in leadership roles in different areas of life. And so the foundation was really great from my family and religious upbringing. I would say that, like so many other people who grew up in a more conservative evangelical home and church life, I had to wrestle with whether that was going to be a stable identity for me, or whether I was going to move in different ways in terms of how I understood theology and ministry and church life in relationship to the world. Clearly, I've done that. And I was aided by that in some way by growing up in New York, because it was a very religiously diverse environment, obviously, ethnically and religiously. And my family of origin also had lots of family in the Lutheran Church. So I had a lot of experience there. I went to a Lutheran school through the 8th grade, learned my creeds and my German hymns, right? So I'm at home in the more mainline church Protestant tradition, and I was at home in the evangelical gospel-oriented tradition. And I think throughout the course of my life, Autumn, I've found a way to straddle both of those worlds and ask what are the good things to hold from both of them, and then to let go of the others. So that's been a growing matter of my own identity as a Christian and as a minister, and as a leader of a Baptist congregation.
Church, I remember years ago, you and I were on the golf course because, of course we were. And,
It's a tough job as a pastor, but someone has to do
that's
it.
right.
Thank you
Yeah,
very
that's right.
much.
Well, ministry takes place everywhere. So we were having this conversation, and I remember you telling me kind of about your life story, and that you went to Southwestern Seminary, you got a master's of divinity, and then you got a PhD in systematic theology, and that you really thought you were headed on an academic track to maybe teach at a university or a seminary, and that changed for you. Tell us a little bit about that transformation of the mindset of heading into academia, but then finding yourself in the local church context.
I wasn't sure it was going to be a mutually exclusive thing, Mitch, as you know, that the Southern Baptist seminaries and our churches were well connected back in those days, and there was a lot of movement back and forth, and teaching adjunctively and things of that nature. I did get a PhD in an era when the tall steeple pastors, you might say, almost all had PhDs. That's actually rare today. But there was, during the period of time I was in seminary, a desire on the part of Southern Baptists to have a real educated clergy and I would say academically oriented leadership in some of our top churches. And so it was encouraged that some of us go on and get PhDs without necessarily expecting that we would teach with them. That's really not true today,
right?
In our culture. So in doing so, I didn't necessarily believe I would be teaching in a seminary setting or a university setting, but I did know that I loved the life of the mind, and I loved the academic world, and I wanted to actually be prepared for that if that was where my calling would be. What I found, though, is that teaching is an important part of the pastoral role, and that it comes out in preaching, of course, but there are other ways that we teach in the congregation. And so I found myself enjoying that and loving the rhythm of church life. When you're teaching, there is a sense that yes, you change from semester to semester and year to year a little bit, and you're growing in your scholarship and whatnot, but you're basically teaching the same classes over and over again. For most of us who are preaching, it's new every Sunday.
Yeah, sure.
And to me, it was always fun to think about that. I got to think about the world and think about a text and not be repeating myself a great deal. I felt like I was growing more in the church than I would have maybe necessarily in the academy.
Right.
Mhm.
So, George, a kid out of New York, college educated, college football player at the University of Miami.
Mhm.
You go to seminary in Fort Worth, and then you spend some time at a church in the South. Was it Alabama? Was the church?
Yes, Mobile.
Mobile,
Mhm.
yeah. And a church comes calling. Now, we all recognize the calling and voice of God in this process.
Mhm.
But 30 years ago, George, what drew you to this congregation in North Dallas?
It actually is almost mystical, Mitch, in that I was talking with a church in Birmingham at the time that Wilshire was looking for a pastor. And I really loved this church in Birmingham. And Kim and I had gone up to uh, visit them, and they'd made an offer and wanted to bring it to the church. And I said that we would consider it, and they gave me till 3 o'clock on Sunday. We found ourselves driving down I-65 back to Mobile that weekend, and Kim and I were looking at each other as we were driving, and there were tears. And we loved that church, and yet we felt like somehow we couldn't go there.
Hmm.
At 3 o'clock on Sunday, I um, I told the committee that I didn't really understand why, but something in me said it wasn't right, and I needed to say no. Before the clock struck 4 that Sunday afternoon, the chair of the search committee at Wilshire called for the first time.
Wow.
Wilshire had been a church when I was in Texas, was one of the few churches I had thought, if they ever were interested, I'd sure like to talk to them. I think that would be the kind of place for me. And so they weren't on my radar. I just knew they were looking. And I admit that I was hoping that they would contact me. And it just so happened. But part of that is I'm a city kid. And I came from New York City, college in Miami, Florida. And I had a wonderful 4 years in Mobile, but Mobile was not really who I am. And Dallas is Texas, but I would say it's more of an American city, somewhat than typical of Texas. So it fits me pretty well.
You almost sound like Tex Schramm there. It's, America's team. It's America's city.
Yeah.
As a native Texan, I can agree with what you say, Mitch. You don't understand because you were born north of the Red River.
True.
Yeah.
So, as someone who is editing each week, a pastor who is no longer in the pulpit, tell me a little bit about how you feel about stepping away from the pulpit. Because, as you said earlier, experiencing God's word as a lens over the life that you're walking with this congregation each week is such a special place. So, tell me a little bit about how you're feeling about that.
I'm going to miss it. Period.
Mm-hmm.
Even the thrill, it's not just the thrill of the moment of standing there and delivering the sermon. As you say, there is a spiritual discipline about the preparation each week that has been part of my spiritual life. And I have really enjoyed that process. I do think that the one thing that I will most enjoy, though, is not having the deadline
Mhm.
every week. So the first part of that word is very apt, deadline. There is a kind of pressure about knowing that it's coming. And I think I've felt that for, 33 years here, nearly 40 years, I guess, of ministry, preaching almost every week. And I think I'm ready to let somebody else feel that deadline and look forward to the weekend with less stress.
Yeah.
Church, I'm glad you said that because when I stepped into my role at Baptist Center for Ethics, now Good Faith Media, that was one question that people often ask me. What's so different about this current job and the week to week grind of being a pastor? And it was easy for me. It was the clock. The clock is always ticking to Sunday morning.
That's right.
And it took about a year for that clock to begin to dissipate and for me to realize that, oh, I don't have to have everything ready to go Sunday morning. And it was, but now that it's happened, it's glorious. The clock is
Yeah.
nowhere to be found. So,
Well, and sort of like how water runs downhill, a pastor will find a pulpit, retired or not. He will find one.
there's a lot of truth to that. A lot of truth to that.
That may be true. I'm willing to preach elsewhere, of course, but I will say, and this is partly just because of the church I have been lucky enough to pastor for all these years, I've never felt as much satisfaction preaching to other people as I have to my own congregation.
Yeah. Well, we have benefited from your pulpit ministry for years. When Missy and I and the boys were living in Fort Worth, I was pastoring at First Baptist Church, Bedford, Texas, in the mid-cities between Fort Worth and Dallas. Each and every morning on our way into town, we'd be listening to NPR, the local affiliate there, and we would hear George Mason deliver his sermon. And it was always a week late because of the delay, but it was such a blessing. And Missy still considers you one of her pastors because for 6 years she listened to you, and then she had to listen to me. So, thanks for the setup there, George. I appreciate it.
Yeah, she grew up on the radio of George Mason and Kid Craddock, right?
Well, that's
That
true.
was the duo running Dallas.
That's exactly right. That's right. So you've announced your retirement. 30 years ago, you stepped into a pulpit that had been occupied by your predecessor, Bruce McKeever, for 30 years. What is your hope for the church and the next pastor?
That I will be as good to my successor as my predecessor was to me. My predecessor, Bruce McKeever, was a great friend to me. He was generous. He knew how to remind people that I was his pastor, and he did not criticize me, even if I'm sure there were many opportunities he must have thought, okay, I better hold my tongue. He really was a great friend. And what Bruce did was to give the congregation also a gift. And that is, he didn't make Wilshire choose between the two of us. The church was able to love us both. And I think that's what I really want to do with my successor. Bruce was pastor emeritus at Wilshire for my first 12 years before his death. So we had plenty of time to work that out.
Right.
And some of the way we did it was for Bruce to continue to do things like memorial services and weddings. Some of the time we would do them together. And sometimes I would just say, why don't you take this one? And it was the kind of thing where he didn't have to go away or disappear or I didn't need for him to be less in order for me to be more, and vice versa.
Mhm.
So it made the handoff a lot easier, even though Bruce and I were very different personalities. Our leadership styles very different, and the church had to adjust to that as well. And so I'm going to try to prepare the church for that same kind of handoff, which also is to say that we're not going to have an interim pastor. We're going to try to move through this. I'm not going to. There is going to be a buffer period with guest preachers, but we have a wonderful staff that can handle the interim period without bringing someone in to create another shift in
Sure.
style and leadership.
Right.
That's great. Well, I mean, you've always spoken fondly about Bruce McKeever, and I know that you're going to be just as gracious and wonderful to your successor. And it's going to be an exciting time. It's going to be a time of sadness to see you step away from the pulpit. The church is going to celebrate your 30 years of ministry with them, but it's also going to be an exciting time to see the new era of Wilshire begin in the next few years. So, thank you for those words.
You're welcome.
So you told us a little bit about your hope for your church, for Wilshire, but I'm going to ask you about the broader church, the church. Let's just zoom in on North America. I think that's a big enough scope for us. Over the past 3 decades of public ministry, what are some of the biggest changes that you've seen and experienced when it comes to church, faith, and culture?
Well, certainly, I think the more recent years have brought to the fore many of the things that had been beneath the surface in the American church. And we weren't aware of just how unsuccessful we had been in being honest with ourselves about the lingering problems of white supremacy and racism, the failure to hold ourselves accountable for the history of our participation in America's marginalizing of Native American people, Mitch, not just because you're on this call, but also women and immigrants and LGBTQ folk, and just how much the church had served to prop up a culture of privilege of white Christian Americans. I think rather than following the script of the Jesus narrative that comes from our New Testament and is a continuation of the story of Israel, that I think, by the way, is also crucial for us to connect the dots to, rather than seeing our role as extending this realm of God in such a way that everyone feel as if they have a place next to everyone else where they can flourish as being children of God. We reinforced the marginalization of folk. And I think it was, it has now become obvious that we had done so. The second thing would be our Christian nationalism, that we have seen how much we have identified our Christian faith with America as somehow chosen by God and special, exceptional. We may be exceptional in certain ways in terms of the history of nations where we have, birthed democracy and fought for individual liberties and things of that nature, but that doesn't make us exceptional in the sense that we are unaccountable for our moral ills. And somehow the church has confused the the realm of God with the American regime. And I think that's been a deeply problematic compromise of the gospel and our identity. So these are a couple of things I think that we are coming to understand, and I'm hopeful we will continue to address.
George, I'm going to ask you two more questions before I turn you over to Autumn for our very final question that we ask every guest. And these are personal of nature, but I'm going to ask them in the context that I want you to answer them, hoping that the next generation of clergy learn from your career and your 3 decades of ministry. The first one is this. What's the greatest regret that you have as a minister looking back upon your career now, in light of hoping the next generation can learn from that regret? And the second is the opposite of that. What do you see as your greatest achievement that you can hand off to the next generation of clergy?
Wonderful questions. I think my greatest regret is how long it took me to change my mind on LGBTQ inclusion in the church. I would say that I wrestled with that question for many, many years, but it took me too long to admit to myself that my understanding of the gospel required that I take another look at my hermeneutics biblically and realize that I was not being consistent in the way I understood the gospel and the movement of God's Spirit in the world. And I was trying to find a way to preserve the institutions that I served while wrestling with my understanding of this matter. And I finally came to the conclusion that I was part of the problem if I didn't take a stand about that. So that's my greatest regret.
Sure.
I guess the thing that I would say generally involves that, but isn't limited to that. And that is the thing that I'm most proud of, that I think I would urge people to recognize who are in positions like mine, is that the things that we fear most about taking positions prophetically on moral issues of our society are, once we do, we find that those fears were not worth capitulating to. That taking a stand for justice and love and grace that is consistent with the gospel is good for our soul too, good for everyone. And because we will feel as though we are on the side of the gospel, the spiritual well-being that comes from that is something that many people don't actually consider when they're fearful of speaking out. So that, in other words, there's an opportunity cost not to speaking out.
Yeah.
You lose the opportunity to experience the blessing of God's presence in your life and the joy of meeting new people and seeing how their lives are changed by the church's welcome of them. The surprise that happens in a community when people of color or people who have been otherwise left out feel as though the church is actually speaking for them for the first time. That's an extraordinary joy that I think we miss out on when we don't step up and speak out.
Well, George Mason, senior pastor at Wilshire Baptist Church for at least a few more months. Also, the one of the founders and host of audio and video podcast, Good God. You can find more about that at goodgodproject.com. If you're interested about Wilshire, if you live around the Dallas, Fort Worth area and want to visit Wilshire, you can check them out. Google Wilshire Baptist Church. It's a wonderful, wonderful congregation that you'll certainly want to attend and visit. Well, before we let you go, George, we ask one question of all of our guests, and Autumn has the distinct pleasure of asking it. So, Autumn, take it away.
As you know, as someone who basically named Good Faith Media, our tagline is there's more to tell. So in light of all of our discussion today and your incredible work, what is your more to tell?
That just because you might plan to retire from a particular job or role doesn't mean that you don't have more to tell. That there's more life past the job you hold currently, the decision you make to leave one thing and move to another, and that you should be thinking about as much about where you're going to as what you're going from. And so that's true for people who are wrestling with retirement questions, but I think it's true all during the course of our life. There is a bias in the Christian faith toward the future, toward the Spirit's call to us to what is next and what is new and what is more. And we should look to participate in that and wonder what more we can tell in the future, regardless of our role.
That's lovely. Well, you heard it first here, folks. We are not pronouncing a benediction on George's career. We're offering an invitation for it to continue. So, George, thank you so much. It's always a delight to visit with you. Please send Kim our love and the best of luck to you, my friend. And I can't wait to see you next time.
Thanks so much, Mitch and Autumn. And we're so proud of all the work Good Faith Media is doing.
To our listeners, thank you so much for joining in this week. Until Autumn and I are back next week, keep living good faith.